Picture this. It's your birthday and your neighbor shows up at your door with a beautiful box of homemade cupcakes, smiling warmly as he wishes you well. You accept the gift graciously, but later that evening, for reasons you can't quite explain, you decide to give them to someone else instead. The next morning, that person is dead, and you realize that those cupcakes weren't meant to be a gift at all. They were meant to be a weapon. And you were supposed to be the target. I'm Linda, and this is exactly what happened to me on my 35th birthday. What should have been a celebration became the beginning of the most terrifying chapter of my life. A chapter that would reveal just how far someone I trusted would go to destroy me. A chapter that would end with a shocking truth that still haunts me to this day. Who was the man I called my neighbor and friend for over 3 years? Why did he want me dead? And what twisted plan did he have in mind when he knocked on my door that April morning? Most importantly, how did a simple act of kindness end up saving my life while costing another woman hers? Before we continue deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. These are the questions that consumed me for months after that terrible day. Questions that would lead police down a dark path of deception, betrayal, and calculated murder. Questions that would ultimately expose a man who had been living a double life right next door to me, planning my death while pretending to be my friend. My story begins in the spring of 2019 when I moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio. At 34, I was finally living my dream of owning my own home. After years of apartment living, I had saved enough to buy a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I was proud of every square foot. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained lawns, and friendly faces everywhere I looked. It felt like the kind of place where children could play safely and neighbors actually knew each other's names. That's where I first met David Richardson. He lived in the house directly across from mine with his wife Sarah. David was in his early 40s, tall and lean with graying temples that gave him a distinguished look. He worked as an insurance adjuster and had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade. Sarah was a few years younger, a kindergarten teacher with warm brown eyes and an infectious laugh. They seemed like the perfect couple, the kind of marriage I hoped to have someday. From the very beginning, David went out of his way to welcome me to the neighborhood. He helped me move in my furniture, introduced me to other neighbors, and even brought over a toolbox when I mentioned needing to hang pictures. Sarah would often join him, bringing homemade cookies or inviting me over for dinner. They quickly became more than just neighbors. They became friends. At least, that's what I thought. David was particularly attentive. He would check on me when I traveled for work, make sure my mail was collected, and even shovel my driveway in winter without being asked. I thought I was lucky to have such caring neighbors. Sarah often joked that her husband had adopted me as his little sister, always looking out for my well-being. Looking back now, I realize that David's attention wasn't born from kindness. It was born from something much darker, something that had been growing inside him from the moment I moved in. You see, David Richardson wasn't the man he appeared to be. While everyone saw a devoted husband and helpful neighbor, the truth was far more disturbing. David had become obsessed with me. Not in a romantic way, but in something far more dangerous. He had convinced himself that I was a threat to his perfect life, his perfect marriage, his perfect reputation in the neighborhood. In his twisted mind, I had become an enemy that needed to be eliminated. The signs were there, but I missed them completely. The way he would appear whenever I had male visitors, asking pointed questions about who they were and why they were there. How he seemed to know my schedule better than I did, always knowing when I was home or away. The strange comments he would make about single women in the neighborhood, how they often brought trouble and disruption to families. I dismissed it all as David being protective, maybe a little old-fashioned, but harmless. Sarah never seemed to notice anything unusual about her husband's behavior, or if she did, she never said anything to me about it. She continued to be warm and welcoming, often inviting me to join them for barbecues or neighborhood events. She would tell me about her students, her dreams of having children someday, and her plans to redecorate their home. She trusted her husband completely, never suspecting that the man she shared a bed with was capable of such darkness. The truth is, David had been planning my murder for months. He had been researching different methods, looking for something that would appear accidental or natural. He had considered everything from tampering with my car to staging a break-in gone wrong. But ultimately, he settled on poison. It was clean, quiet, and if done right, nearly impossible to trace. He had been experimenting with different substances, learning about dosages and symptoms. He had even practiced his technique, testing small amounts on stray cats in the neighborhood. Several pets went missing during those months, and now I know what happened to them. April 15th, 2020, started like any other day. I woke up excited because it was my 35th birthday. I had planned a quiet celebration, maybe dinner with a few friends later in the week. I never made a big deal about birthdays, preferring small gatherings to elaborate parties. I was working from home that day, enjoying the flexibility of my job as a graphic designer. The morning was peaceful, and I was looking forward to treating myself to something special. Around 10:30 a.m., there was a knock at my front door. Through the peephole, I could see David standing on my porch, holding a white bakery box tied with a bright yellow ribbon. He was smiling that familiar, friendly smile I had come to trust over the past year. I opened the door, and he immediately wished me a happy birthday, explaining that Sarah had mentioned it was my special day. "Linda, happy birthday," he said, extending the box toward me. "Sarah made these for you this morning. She insisted on using her grandmother's recipe. She said you mentioned loving chocolate cupcakes at the barbecue last month." His voice was cheerful, his demeanor completely normal. There was nothing in his behavior to suggest that he was handing me my own death sentence. I accepted the gift graciously, thanking him for Sarah's thoughtfulness. The box felt substantial in my hands, and I could smell the rich aroma of chocolate cake through the cardboard. David lingered on my doorstep for a few minutes, making small talk about the weather and asking about my work. He seemed relaxed, almost cheerful. Now I know he was probably savoring the moment, imagining how the scene would play out once I consumed his poisoned gift. After David left, I carried the box to my kitchen and opened it. Inside were 6 beautiful chocolate cupcakes, each one perfectly decorated with swirls of dark chocolate frosting and topped with colorful sprinkles. They looked professional, like something you might buy from an expensive bakery. The presentation was flawless. Sarah had always been talented in the kitchen, but these seemed to exceed even her usual standards. I set the box on my counter and went back to work, planning to enjoy one with my afternoon coffee. But as the day progressed, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the entire interaction with David. His behavior had seemed forced, like he was performing rather than genuinely celebrating my birthday. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. By late afternoon, I had made a decision that would save my life. Instead of eating the cupcakes myself, I decided to share them with Sarah. It seemed like the perfect way to thank her for her kindness, while also getting a chance to catch up with her. I had noticed that she seemed stressed lately, often looking tired when I saw her in the yard or at the mailbox. I thought some company and sweet treats might cheer her up. Around 6 p.m., I walked across the street to the Richardson house, carrying the box of cupcakes. David's car wasn't in the driveway, which was unusual for that time of day. Sarah answered the door looking surprised but pleased to see me. She was wearing a yellow sundress that brought out the gold highlights in her brown hair, and despite looking tired, she smiled warmly when she saw me. "Linda, what a nice surprise," she said, inviting me inside. "David mentioned he brought you my cupcakes this morning. How were they? I explained that I wanted to share them with her, since she had been so kind to make them for me. Sarah looked puzzled for a moment, a slight frown crossing her face. "That's so sweet of you," she said. "But you know, I didn't actually make those cupcakes. David brought them home yesterday and said he had picked them up from the bakery on 5th Street for your birthday. I was wondering why he didn't just ask me to bake something instead." A chill ran down my spine. David had lied about Sarah making the cupcakes. But why would he lie about something so simple? I tried to keep my voice casual as I asked Sarah about it, but I could see confusion in her eyes too. We sat at her kitchen table, and I opened the box again, studying the cupcakes more carefully. They really did look professionally made, not like typical home-baked goods. Sarah selected one of the cupcakes and took a bite, complimenting the rich chocolate flavor. I took one as well, but something made me hesitate before eating it. Call it intuition, call it luck, but I found myself just holding the cupcake, listening to Sarah talk about her day at school. She finished hers quickly, saying how much she loved chocolate, and even reached for a second one. We chatted for about an hour before I excused myself, saying I had some work to finish. Sarah thanked me again for sharing the cupcakes and mentioned that she might save the rest for David when he got home from his evening meeting. As I walked back to my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The lie about who made the cupcakes kept bothering me, playing over and over in my mind. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about David's strange behavior, the elaborate lie about the cupcakes, and Sarah's confusion about not making them. Something was definitely wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. I found myself getting up several times to check the locks on my doors, feeling inexplicably anxious. The next morning, April 16th, I was awakened by the sound of sirens. Multiple emergency vehicles were racing down our usually quiet street. I looked out my bedroom window and felt my blood turn to ice. 3 ambulances and 2 police cars were parked in front of the Richardson house. Paramedics were rushing in and out of the front door, their movements urgent and coordinated. I threw on clothes and ran outside, joining other neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalk. Mrs. Henderson from next door was crying, her hands pressed to her mouth in shock. "It's Sarah," she whispered when she saw me. "They found her this morning. David called 911 around 7 a.m. saying she wasn't breathing." My legs nearly gave out beneath me. Sarah, who had been laughing and talking with me just 12 hours earlier, was fighting for her life. I watched in horror as paramedics brought a stretcher out of the house. Sarah was unconscious, her face pale and her body completely still. David followed close behind, his face a mask of devastation and panic. He was crying, reaching for his wife as they loaded her into the ambulance. One of the paramedics was talking rapidly into his radio, and I caught fragments of what he was saying. Severe respiratory distress, possible poisoning, immediate transport needed. The word poisoning hit me like a physical blow. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The cupcakes, the lies, David's strange behavior, the feeling that something was wrong. Sarah was rushed to Columbus General Hospital, but despite the doctor's best efforts, she never regained consciousness. She died 3 hours later from what appeared to be acute poisoning from an unknown substance. The official cause of death would later be determined as aconitine poisoning, a highly toxic compound derived from the monkshood plant. It's a poison that acts quickly, causing severe cardiac and respiratory failure. David's performance at the hospital was Oscar-worthy. He was the picture of a devastated husband, demanding answers from doctors, calling Sarah's family, making arrangements with his insurance company. Everyone who saw him that day described him as completely distraught, a man who had lost the love of his life. No one suspected that he was actually witnessing the successful completion of his murder plan, just with the wrong victim. The police initially treated Sarah's death as a tragic accident, or possibly suicide. Young, healthy people don't usually die from exotic plant poisoning without some explanation. They questioned David extensively, but his story was consistent. He had come home from work the night before to find Sarah feeling unwell. She had complained of stomach pain and nausea. He suggested she get some rest, and when he woke up the next morning, she was unconscious. But I knew the truth. Or at least, I suspected it. The cupcakes were the key to everything. I spent the entire day of Sarah's death wrestling with whether to contact the police. What if I was wrong? What if it really was just a tragic coincidence? But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that those cupcakes had been poisoned, and they had been meant for me. That evening, I finally called the Columbus Police Department and asked to speak with the detective handling Sarah Richardson's death. Detective Maria Santos was a seasoned investigator with over 15 years of experience in homicide cases. She listened patiently as I told her about the cupcakes, David's lies, and my growing suspicion that Sarah had died from eating poison that was intended for me. Detective Santos was skeptical at first. The idea that a neighbor would try to poison someone with birthday cupcakes sounded like something from a television show, not real life. But she agreed to meet with me the following day to hear my full account. I spent that night writing down every detail I could remember about my interactions with David, looking for patterns or clues I might have missed. When Detective Santos arrived at my house the next morning, I showed her the remaining cupcakes that Sarah hadn't eaten. There were 3 left in the box, still sitting on my kitchen counter where I had left them after returning from Sarah's house. The detective carefully bagged them as evidence, explaining that they would be tested for any harmful substances. The toxicology results came back 2 days later, and they confirmed my worst fears. All 3 remaining cupcakes contained lethal doses of aconitine, the same poison that had killed Sarah. The concentration was so high that even 1 cupcake would have been enough to kill an adult within hours. Whoever had prepared these cupcakes had intended to commit murder, and they had done their research to ensure the poison would be effective. With this evidence, the police began investigating David Richardson in earnest. They obtained warrants to search his home, his car, and his workplace. What they found painted a picture of a man who had been planning murder for months. Hidden in his basement workshop, investigators discovered books about poisonous plants, printed articles about aconitine, and detailed notes about dosages and symptoms. Most damning of all, they found seeds and plant matter from the monkshood plant, along with equipment for extracting and concentrating the toxic compound. David's computer revealed even more disturbing evidence. His browser history showed extensive research into methods of murder, with particular focus on poisoning techniques that would be difficult to detect. He had visited forums where people discussed crime novels and true crime cases, asking questions about how certain poisons worked and whether they could be detected in autopsies. He had even researched my daily routine, my work schedule, and my personal habits. The investigation also revealed that David had purchased several items under false names that were consistent with poison preparation. He had bought specialized glassware, chemicals, and even a small freezer that he claimed was for storing bait for fishing. The freezer, it turned out, contained samples of the poison he had been developing, carefully stored in small vials and labeled with dates and concentration levels. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was David's journal. Hidden behind a false wall in his basement, police found a detailed account of his growing obsession with me and his plan to eliminate what he saw as a threat to his marriage and his standing in the community. The entries spanned several months, documenting his progression from mild annoyance to murderous intent. As the investigation deepened, Detective Santos uncovered a truth that was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. David Richardson wasn't just a neighbor who had developed an unhealthy obsession. He was a man with a history of violence against women, a history that had been carefully hidden and covered up for years. The breakthrough came when Detective Santos decided to run David's fingerprints through a national database. What she found sent shockwaves through the entire investigation team. David Richardson wasn't his real name. His actual name was David Morton, and he had been wanted by police in 3 different states for the murders of 2 women and the disappearance of a third. The first victim had been his previous wife, Jennifer Morton, who had died in Minneapolis in 2015 from what was ruled accidental food poisoning. Jennifer had been found dead in their home after eating dinner that David claimed to have prepared for their anniversary. The case had been closed when investigators couldn't prove that the food poisoning was intentional, despite some suspicious circumstances. The second victim was a co-worker named Michelle Torres in Denver, Colorado in 2017. Michelle had been found dead in her apartment after eating lunch that David had brought her from a local restaurant. Again, the death was attributed to severe food poisoning, but some detectives had suspected foul play. David had left Colorado shortly after Michelle's death, claiming he needed a fresh start after losing a dear friend. The third case involved a woman named Rebecca Kim in Phoenix, Arizona, in 2018. Rebecca had been David's girlfriend for several months before she suddenly disappeared. Her family reported her missing, and during the investigation, several witnesses mentioned seeing her with David on the day she vanished. But David had an alibi, and without a body, there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. He left Phoenix just weeks after Rebecca's disappearance. Each time, David had changed his identity slightly, moving to a new state and creating a new life. He was skilled at reinvention, carefully crafting a persona that would allow him to blend into suburban communities. He would find work in ordinary jobs, present himself as a reliable, helpful neighbor, and eventually marry women who could provide him with the perfect cover of respectability. Sarah Richardson, it turned out, had been his 4th wife. She had no idea about his previous identities or his history of violence. To her, he was simply David, the insurance adjuster who had swept her off her feet with his charm and attentiveness. She had married him in 2019, just months before I moved into the neighborhood. But why had David decided to target me? The answer lay in those journal entries found in his basement. According to his writings, David saw me as a threat to the perfect life he had built with Sarah. He was convinced that I was suspicious of him, that I was asking too many questions and getting too close to uncovering his secrets. In his paranoid mind, I had become an enemy who needed to be eliminated before I could expose him. The journal entries revealed that David had been watching me constantly, interpreting innocent actions as evidence of my supposed investigation into his background. When I asked about his previous jobs, he saw it as interrogation. When I mentioned that he looked familiar, he convinced himself that I recognized him from news reports about his previous crimes. When I complimented Sarah on her cooking and asked for recipes, he interpreted it as an attempt to gather evidence about his methods of poisoning. The truth was far simpler and more tragic. I had never suspected David of anything. I thought he was a helpful, if slightly overprotective neighbor. I had no knowledge of his past or his true identity. My questions were those of a friendly neighbor trying to build relationships in a new community. But in David's twisted mind, my normal social interactions had become evidence of a conspiracy against him. Detective Santos also discovered that David had been planning to kill me for months. The cupcakes weren't his first attempt. He had been looking for the right opportunity and the right method. He had considered poisoning my water supply by tampering with my outdoor spigot. He had thought about contaminating food deliveries to my house. He had even considered breaking into my home and injecting poison into items in my refrigerator. But the birthday cupcakes had seemed perfect. It was a gift that I would be likely to consume quickly and completely. The poison was tasteless when mixed with chocolate, and the symptoms would appear several hours after consumption, giving David time to establish an alibi. He had planned to be at work when I became ill, surrounded by colleagues who could vouch for his presence. The most shocking revelation came when police examined David's relationship with Sarah more closely. What they discovered would fundamentally change how everyone understood the case. Sarah Richardson hadn't been an innocent victim who accidentally consumed poison meant for me. She had been David's intended target all along. The evidence came from David's computer, where investigators found a second set of files that had been encrypted and hidden. These files revealed that David had grown tired of Sarah and was planning to kill her to collect on her life insurance policy, while also eliminating what he saw as the growing threat I posed to his secret. The Cupcakes had been an elaborate plan to commit 2 murders and make them look like the work of a deranged neighbor who had poisoned the wrong person. David's plan was diabolically clever. He intended to give me the poisoned cupcakes, knowing that I would likely share them with Sarah, as I had done with previous gifts. When both women died from the same poison, the investigation would focus on finding a common source. David would play the role of the grieving husband, while also being the helpful neighbor who provided key information to police. He had prepared evidence to implicate a local baker who had been struggling financially and had a history of mental health issues. David had purchased the cupcakes from this baker's shop several times over the previous weeks, establishing a connection that police would eventually discover. He had even planted some of the monkshood plant material near the bakery, planning to find it during a neighborhood search and report it to authorities. But David's plan had a fatal flaw. He hadn't counted on my instinctive reluctance to eat the cupcakes that morning. If I had consumed even one cupcake, I would have died within hours, just as Sarah had. The poison was so concentrated that there was no antidote, no chance of survival once it entered the bloodstream. The insurance angle provided the final piece of the puzzle. Sarah had recently increased her life insurance policy to $500,000, with David as the sole beneficiary. The policy had been purchased just 6 months earlier, after David had convinced Sarah that they needed more coverage for their future children. What Sarah didn't know was that David had been researching the policy's terms and had learned that it would pay out in full even if she died from accidental poisoning. During his interrogation, David finally confessed, but not in the way anyone expected. He didn't show remorse for Sarah's death or relief at being caught. Instead, he expressed frustration that his plan hadn't worked perfectly. He complained that I had ruined everything by not eating the cupcakes myself. He seemed more upset about the failure of his scheme than about the fact that he had murdered his wife. David revealed that he had been planning to leave Columbus after collecting Sarah's insurance money. He had already created a new identity and had been preparing to move to Portland, Oregon, where he planned to find his next victim. Sarah's death was supposed to be his final act in Ohio before disappearing forever. The trial of David Morton began 8 months later and lasted 3 weeks. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His fingerprints were on the poison-making equipment. His DNA was found on the plant material, and his computer files contained detailed plans for the murders. The prosecution also brought in expert testimony about aconitine poisoning and witnesses who testified about David's suspicious behavior in previous cities. David's defense attorney tried to argue that his client was mentally ill, suffering from paranoid delusions that made him believe he was in constant danger from neighbors and co-workers. But the carefully planned nature of his crimes and his ability to maintain multiple false identities over many years proved that he was competent and calculating. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on charges of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and identity fraud. David was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Additional charges related to his previous victims in other states were still pending, but he would never be free again. As I stand here today, 2 years after that terrible birthday, I still struggle with the knowledge that my simple act of kindness cost Sarah Richardson her life. If I had eaten those cupcakes myself, as David intended, Sarah would still be alive. She would still be teaching kindergarten, still dreaming of having children, still believing in the goodness of the man she married. But I've also learned that I couldn't have known what David was planning. None of us could have predicted that the helpful neighbor who shoveled driveways and carried groceries was actually a serial killer who saw threats everywhere he looked. Sarah's death wasn't my fault, just as the deaths of Jennifer, Michelle, and Rebecca weren't the fault of the people who knew and trusted David in those other cities. The investigation revealed that David had been escalating his violence for years, becoming more bold and more careless with each crime. Eventually, he would have been caught. But by then, how many more innocent women would have died? In some ways, my survival and Sarah's tragic death prevented what could have been many more murders. I moved away from Maple Street 6 months after the trial ended. I couldn't continue living in that house, looking across the street at the home where Sarah died because of a gift that was meant to kill me. But I carry her memory with me, along with the memories of all the other women who died at David's hands. The hardest part is knowing that Sarah died believing her husband loved her. She never knew that the man she trusted was planning her murder. She spent her last evening sharing cupcakes and laughter with me, talking about her students and her dreams for the future. In those final hours, she was happy. Today, I work with law enforcement agencies to help them understand how predators like David operate in suburban communities. I speak at conferences about the warning signs that neighbors and friends should watch for. I've learned that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like helpful neighbors who bring you birthday cupcakes. What do you think would have happened if I had eaten those cupcakes that morning? Would David's plan have worked? Or would investigators have eventually connected him to Sarah's death anyway? Was there anything I could have done differently to save her life? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We share true crime stories every week. Stories that remind us that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. Share this video with others who might benefit from hearing Sarah's story and learning about the dangers that can exist right next door. If you love stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share with people around you. See you in my next video, where we'll explore another case that proves truth really is stranger than fiction.